With the diagram for Lesson 55, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, we have come to the last of the letters of St. Paul. In fact, perhaps the last of any of his writing, because we'll find Hebrews may not have been his. I was much influenced in the early writing about these letters with the analysis given in the Oxford Bible that there was suspicion about these not being St. Paul's writing because there were differences. They were briefer, as you see on your diagram. They had a different theology. Faith no longer means this leap of the heart toward Jesus, of belief in him, faith. Now it means orthodox theology. There seems to be a development now about new circumstances, or maybe it's just a new secretary. Or is this just the rewriting of some remnants of Paul's letters, that some other post-Pauline writer using his name has fixed them up? Well, I think I was unduly influenced by the Oxford Bible, because I'm much more keen to report that the Jerome commentary just pushes all those objections away and says, let's look at this as it really is. These are letters to two people that he knows very well. They know his theology. He doesn't have to go into any of that. He may have just seen them, but he needs to remind them of a few things. Of course, he's writing briefly. He doesn't have to have a new secretary even. He just is not going back over old material. And besides, the church is developing, and if you belong to any organization at all, you see how rapidly it can develop new angles. It can throw out old bylaws and have new. It can have new types of officers just because the organization itself is meeting more demands or new experiences in its community. Well, that's just common knowledge that within a very few months, not years even, an organization will reorganize and set itself out in a new direction. So there shouldn't be any surprise about that Paul is writing to new situations. These little churches are growing. They're meeting new demands all the time. There are this rise of particular heresies. These little communities began with a strong admixture of Jews and Gentiles. And some of those Jews come with many of their old habits, things that have meant very much to them in the past. For instance, genealogies. We see how important it was to know what tribe you belonged to, what your genealogy was. And the Jews who are in now the Christian community wouldn't have lost that interest. They also had developed an affection for the angelic hosts, the realms of angels. They didn't just drop that all of a sudden, but there was a danger that they would begin to, as teachers, teach things that really had no relevance to a Christian community, something founded on Jesus Christ, his death, his resurrection, and his presence with them in the Holy Spirit. So these kinds of things had to be sorted out, and we see that Paul in these letters is addressing some of these stances of people that could become heretical. We also saw in our last lesson that there was a rise of a kind of Gnosticism, maybe Jewish Gnosticism. That is a kind of special knowledge that these people who held it felt was very important to have others know that they were in the know. They knew things. They had a special knowledge, Gnosticism. It may have had to do with these genealogies, with angelic things, but whatever it was not Christian. Gnosticism is not where it's at. And we saw Paul starting to use a new word, epignosis. His was full knowledge, and it had to do only with Jesus Christ and Him crucified and risen from the dead. That was the true knowledge. So even on your diagram, you see these rise of heresies. Certain troublemakers seem to follow the churches around, the Judaizers who continue to seem to want to press these old Jewish laws upon the new congregation. So he is making a point of setting these things straight. We see that when he's writing 1 Timothy and Titus, even as your diagram shows, Paul is freed from prison. We last left him writing letters from prison. Then we believe that he was released, that he flew off, not flew in the way we think, but he was always on the fly, off to the east to evangelize in Spain, which many early writers, even in the 1st or 2nd century, claim that he indeed did. Then he has come back to his old grounds and refreshed his relationship with those early churches. And so he has put Timothy as head, we would now say bishop, in Ephesus, and he has placed Titus in Crete also as head over that little church. We would now say a bishop. At the time, they're simply known as elders, as overseers, which is the word bishop, actually. So he is writing to these two that he has put in this very prominent position in these two churches. And he is explaining that he is going to winter in Nicopolis, so he is free. That is a totally different scene when he is writing from 2 Timothy, writing to Timothy again in a letter, in which he is anything but free. He is in shackles. He is in prison. And this isn't the kind of freedom that he had in that first imprisonment. There is a prison in Rome that you can visit as a visitor. It's down in a dark place, and it is held that both Peter and Paul spent time in that prison. And there is that note of discouragement. Well, perhaps not discouragement, just acceptance of a dark fate. He does complain that no one stood by him in his first examination before the authorities, and that he feels bereft. He does ask that, I think it's Mark that he would like to have come. But this imprisonment does sound like it will end in his death, and it no doubt does in probably 66 or 67. Now we've taken this early part of your diagram, all of those resistances to this being actually Paul's letters, and put them, I hope, aside, because as I say, I would be much more inclined to go with the Jerome commentary, that easily sets these objections aside. These are, indeed, Paul's letters. As we see, there is a difference in the organization of these churches. They have grown. They now have deacons and, as we say, bishops, and the elders will eventually, within a few years, I think, be called priests. So this evolving is normal and natural, and there have to be some instructions about how these people will be chosen and what their lives should reflect in order to be in these orders. There is also mentioned an order of widows in 1 Timothy, that they should be true widows, and that if the family can take care of them, they should. If they have no family, then of course the church should be responsible for caring for them. But the idea of an order is a development, that there should be some kind of vow taken, and that they should be perhaps living in some house as a community. We are not just sure what that means, but the church will look after this order, and these women, these widows, will probably have some responsibilities in the church, something that they can do, that they alone can do. And they are asked to train younger women to love their husbands and care for their children, and to be submissive now. There we have the word, hupotasso, that we looked at last lesson. It is a key to understanding the relationship of woman, of a wife, to her husband. It is lined out in Ephesians in the last couple chapters, how important it is that this woman is submissive, not subjected, but submissive to her husband. We are noticing all the way along that Paul must struggle with these young churches to get them to understand how unity is achieved through the obedience to the elders, and the elders obedient to a bishop eventually. And as time goes on, it will become more and more clear, which it isn't right now in these early churches, the necessity for Peter the Rock being a pope, the Papa, in Rome, because by 67 he will be hung upside down on a cross by Nero in Rome, and we will have his martyrdom as the first head of the church. Following him will come Linus, and then I believe it's Clement. By the time of Clement, the Holy Father, as we'll say, or the Pope, the successor of Peter in Rome, has real authority, and he begins to use it by telling some of these churches how to behave, so that he is interfering, we'd say, into the affairs of little local churches. No, he doesn't consider it interference. He is assuming the role of Papa, of Pope. So this too is a development. But how will these little churches hold together and become obedient to the headship of Peter or his successors? Well, it takes development. It doesn't happen immediately. We don't have Paul telling these little churches, now be obedient to Peter. We never hear him say that once. We've seen in his own life that he understands that Peter is the rock. He calls him rock. Calling him rock means one thing. He knows that Jesus established him as the rock. So Peter is acknowledged by Paul, but never is there any development of his role in these early churches. So this will also develop. One of the wonderful things about our Catholic faith is development. It is not a static organization. It develops out of the root of the teaching and life, death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, and no other. That is its root. But it will develop. So we do see this development of these churches in their organization with the relationship to the Roman pontiff, something still to be understood. I would like to go back now for a few minutes to look at the role of woman in the early church. We've already seen Paul having to speak very harshly, we'd say, to the group in Corinth about the effect of the women who were assuming a leadership that he did not believe they should have. So what is this? Is this really what feminism has led us to believe? That women from the very beginning, from maybe even the Garden of Eden, are less than, have less respect, have a less authoritative role than men, and that this must be corrected in society? We have seen the inroads of feminism even in the Catholic Church, and we really must understand what's going on here, because feminism, in its secular way, has also brought to us same-sex marriage. If man and woman have equal authority and are not in any kind of a headship relationship, it follows that the meaning of sexuality is nothing, and therefore the next step is same-sex marriage. And I know that this talk is going to get me into trouble, but it doesn't matter because it is the truth. Feminism, in the way it is understood secularly, is an affront to the truth that has been laid down in the Catholic Church, because man and woman are equals, but equality does not mean that they are the same in all regards. They are not. That one is a head and the other is a follower does not make one better, have more worth than the other. They both have worth. How do I know this? Because I look to the Trinity. The Father and the Son are equals. They have the same worth. They are both God. But the Son defers to the headship of the Father in order for there to be perfect unity. And we have seen right along that this is the model for man and woman. They are equals. They have the same worth, the same value in the eyes of God. But one is the head and the other, hupotasso, is obedient or submissive, which brings about the unity that God desires for His church to Himself, and why the Catholic Church has headship from the top on. It does not mean that those who have authority or headship are better, have more worth, or any such thing. That is the devil's value on headship. The devil's value on being an authority. It is not of Christ, and it is not to be found in His church. And this is why it is so important for the church to understand the significance of the role of man and woman and its difference in the way it's executed in Christ's church. We really are seeing a blurring of the lines in the church because of the exterior pressures of secular feminism, and we should be aware of it and guard against it. In 1 Timothy, Paul describes woman learning in silence with all submissiveness, hupotasso, I permit no woman to teach or have authority over men. She is to keep silent. Wow, that's pretty strong language. So what does it really mean? Well, the Greek word for to have authority is authentio. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but it is something that we would take as meaning authentic. In other words, this woman has no authority in herself, no authenticio in herself over men. No, she has not been given that. And to keep silent, it must be, as Paul described in Corinthians, that these women are really misunderstanding what salvation in Christ means. It does not take away the fact that they are physically under the control of a husband. They are not less worthy. They have a different role, and it is a key for all of the people of God. If they are not obedient, if they don't know the meaning of hupotasso in their own relationships, if they do not lead by that significant way of being obedient, the church will not be obedient. There will be no respect or honoring for these elders, these priests, as they will be called, for the bishops, because this church is organized on the basis of authority and hupotasso, and that is what brings it unity, even as it is a unifying factor in the relationship of man and woman. Please, do you understand that to be obedient or to be submissive is a highly worthy goal? Because Jesus, he demonstrates it all the way to the cross. You don't think less of him for that, do you? You must not misunderstand the role of women in the church, because if you do, you might as well be Protestant. Paul goes on in this to say women will be saved through bearing children. Well, that's a strange thing. And actually, there's a better translation. Women are saved through bearing the divine child. This is Mary. When we are Marian, when we are like Mary, we bear the divine child to our church, to the people around us. This is the grace given to women. This is the beauty of their call. It is far superior to being a priest, or even a deacon for that matter. It is the key to understanding Christian life for Jesus Christ. So, women are saved through bearing the divine child. Let's change that in 1 Timothy chapter 2. Then he goes on to saying that he would have the older women teach the younger women to marry, bear children, and rule their households. Isn't that interesting? That's a Greek word that means the house despot. She is to rule her household. She has an area in which she has the freedom to rule. And that is to organize and to keep everything going smoothly within the walls of her house. And her husband had best give her that freedom and the money to do it. That is her realm. And most women love it, make it beautiful, keep it good, making sure that no evil influences come into it, and keep it unified by her obedience and her love, which is really obedience, to her husband. So with that, I'm going to leave off my little tirade, I guess you'd have to say, about Paul's understanding about woman's role. He is telling in Titus, he explains how all of the people of God are to be treated, the old men, the young men. Titus is a very favorite of his, and Timothy too. He calls them both sons, and we are able to leave them at their bishopric, knowing that they will carry on the love of Jesus Christ for his church.